Now let's move on to the most sinister medical practice, bloodletting. Doctors drain quarts of blood from their patients for any reason. Historians laugh at this, calling it medieval barbarism. But let's look at it from the perspective of survival after a catastrophe. If the blood is saturated with toxins, if the lymphatic system is overloaded with breakdown products, then the mechanical removal of contaminated fluid is the only way to prolong life. This was primitive dialysis. They drained the infected blood, hoping the body would produce new, clean blood. This was not superstition. It was a harsh, bloody logic of survival in a critically poisoned environment. Think about the fashion for high collars, jabot, and neckerchiefs, which appeared precisely during this period. What were they hiding? Fashion? No, they were hiding thyroid problems, goiters, and surgical scars. The thyroid gland is the first organ to react to radiation. An epidemic of throat and neck diseases forced Taylor to create clothing that covered people up to their chins. Gloves worn constantly, even indoors, conceal ulcers on hands and deformed nails. Here we come to architectural inconsistencies that scream that the environment changed and the people living in it were newcomers or survivors, but not the builders. Look at the palaces of St. Petersburg in Europe. Gigantic single-pane windows, enormous halls with towering ceilings. And this is in the midst of the so-called Little Ice Age. We are told that the climate was harsh. Rivers froze to the bottom. Yet aristocrats built buildings impossible to heat. This is absurd. Bald, sick people in silks and wigs would have frozen to death in these stone boxes. The fireplaces we see now often look like decorative inserts added later. They are disproportionately small for such volumes. This means that the buildings were constructed for a different climate and by different beings who did not require such heating, and the hairless aristocrats simply occupied the ruins of a past civilization, trying to warm themselves by primitive hearths. They were refugees on their own planet, having lost health and technology, forced to hide their bald heads under wigs and their freezing bodies under layers of clothing in giant foreign homes. Look at the buildings in the historic center of your city, wherever you live, Moscow, South Korea, Prague, or Rome. You see the same picture that your brain is accustomed to ignoring. The windows of the first floors go deep underground. We are told this is the so-called cultural layer. Supposedly, over 2 or 3 centuries, people accumulated so much trash and dirt that the ground level rose by several yards. Think about this nonsense. Do you believe that aristocrats in powdered wigs and silk stockings who cared so much about their status walked knee-deep in waste for years, allowing their main entrances and windows to be buried? We are asked to believe that city dwellers were so lazy that they didn't remove trash but simply compacted it and built new roads over the first floors. But this is a lie designed for idiots. No cultural layer of such magnitude exists. Dirt does not grow on its own like grass. Before us are traces of a global catastrophe, that very flood or planetary scale mudslide that covered civilization with clay and silt. And here we return to our hairless aristocrats. The connection between buried floors and wigs is direct and terrifying. The catastrophe that buried the first floors of buildings brought with it not just soil. This clay was saturated with chemical or radioactive elements. The ground was radioactive. Those who survived or came to these territories immediately after the catastrophe found themselves at the epicenter of contamination. Vapors from this alluvial clay, which covered yards of space, struck at the most vulnerable, the endocrine system and hair follicles. People were literally living on a radioactive dump of history. This is precisely why the baldness epidemic affected everyone simultaneously. The closer to the ground, the closer to the cultural layer, the stronger the impact. Perhaps this is why the nobility tried to live on the second and third floors, leaving the first for servants or utility needs, but even that didn't save them. The atmosphere was poisoned everywhere. Now let's compare the technological capabilities of bald people in wigs with what is attributed to them. Official history claims that these people, treated with mercury and lacking basic sanitation, built magnificent star fortresses across the planet. Have you seen the geometry of these forts? They are perfect mathematical figures, precise to the inch, clad in stone weighing tons. We are told that soldiers with shovels and wheelbarrows did this. This is technological absurdity. The volume of earth and stonework involved in building just one such star exceeds the capabilities of any 18th century army, even if they worked around the clock without food or sleep. And there are thousands of such stars, from Europe to Japan. Who built them? Bald, sick people dying at 40 from lead poisoning? No, they didn't build them, they excavated them. The era we call a time of construction was actually an era of great excavation. The 18th century aristocrats were not creators, they were squatters. They occupied empty clay-covered cities of a highly advanced preceding civilization. They inserted their primitive wooden frames into gigantic openings designed for completely different glazing technologies. They hung their paintings over fresco they couldn't restore. They called it founding cities, though in reality it was an inventory of ruins. That's why in old paintings we see ruinists, artists who depicted ruins with photographic accuracy, overgrown with trees right in the middle of flourishing capitals. We are told these were artists' fantasies, but why fantasize about ruins if you live in a new developing world? The artists were depicting reality. They were documenting the process of new masters, those very hairless people in wigs inhabiting dead cities. Look at the brick production numbers. Building just one block of St. Petersburg or London would require hundreds of millions of bricks. Where are the factories? Where are the quarries? Where is the logistics? There is no data in archives about gigantic industrial complexes capable of providing such a volume. We are shown makeshift shacks where men manually molded bricks. This is laughable. If you calculate the speed of manual production, building just one Hermitage would have taken millennia. The conclusion is obvious. The buildings were already standing. They were constructed from materials whose creation technology we have lost. The brick we see in old masonry often surpasses modern concrete in quality. It rings like metal. And the 19th century builders simply plastered over what they found and claimed it as their own. This explains why the aristocracy so desperately tried to create the appearance of ancient lineage. They needed to legitimize their right to these palaces. Wigs, elaborate rituals, fabricated genealogies, all of it was theater. Theater designed to convince the populace that these weak, bald people were the rightful heirs of the gods who built this world. But the truth breaks through the cracks. Discrepancies in height. Doorknobs on old doors are often placed too high for a modern person. Stair steps can be uncomfortably high or wide. The acoustics of halls designed for something other than balls and music. All of this was not created for people standing 5'7" and tall. We live in the homes of giants who were destroyed, and in their place came dwarves donning someone else's hair. But the most terrifying question is not even who built them, but where the population came from to inhabit these cities after the catastrophe. Demographic charts of the 19th century show an unnatural explosive population growth that is biologically impossible without external intervention, as if someone turned on an incubator. Let's face the truth and turn to dry, unemotional statistics that dismantle the official worldview faster than any dynamite. If you open demographic charts of the 19th century, you will see something that defies any biological explanation. The population growth curve doesn't just go up, it soars vertically. They try to convince us that this is the result of improved medicine in the agrarian revolution. But we just discussed that medicine of that time was bloodletting and mercury, and cities were buried under clay and filth. In conditions of total unsanitary practices, epidemics of cholera, smallpox, and typhus with no antibiotics, the Earth's population suddenly began to double and triple in record time. This is mathematically impossible. Women physically could not have given birth to so many surviving children under those circumstances. The only logical explanation for this phenomenon is a massive influx of adult or adolescent population from outside, or the artificial cultivation of humans on an industrial scale. And this is where the so-called foundling hospitals enter the scene. These gigantic structures appear in Moscow, St. Petersburg, London, and Paris almost simultaneously. Look at the Moscow Foundling Hospital. It's not an orphanage. It's a veritable factory, a massive complex, a palace surpassing many royal residences in the scale. The facade is hundreds of yards long. Why spend millions of gold rubles, thousands of tons of scarce bricks on maintaining illegitimate children whom society at the time presumably should have despised? Official statistics claim that millions of infants pass through these homes. Millions. Where did such a number of abandoned children come from in a patriarchal religious society where extramarital affairs were a sin? We are told poverty, but even in poverty, mothers do not give up their children to concentration camps to certain death in such quantities. This contradicts the instinct for species survival. There is a terrifying hypothesis that these foundling hospitals were not orphanages, but distribution centers or even incubators. Archives contain strange mentions that infants were brought in by convoys, thousands of them, without documents, without names. They were simply numbered. It was an assembly line. Where did they come from? One theory is that these were children taken from the population of conquered territories, from those who remembered the old world. But there is an even more frightening theory. Cloning or artificial cultivation technologies that remained from a past world civilization and were used by the new masters of life to quickly restore the workforce. They needed slaves. They needed hands to excavate buried cities, lay railways, and work in the factories. The ideal slave is one who does not remember their parents, does not know their history, and has no familial attachment. Look at photographs from the late 19th century, factory floors full of children, armies of uniformly dressed soldiers with similar faces. This is the generations who don't remember their kinship. They were raised in barracks-like conditions, given minimal skills, taught a primitive language, and instilled with a new fabricated history. This is why we know nothing about the catastrophe. The chain of oral information transmission was broken. Between us and our real ancestors stands a wall of this incubator generation. They could not tell their grandchildren the truth about the past because they had no past. Their memory began with a cot in the foundling hospital and the overseer's whistle. They were a blank slate upon which the new elites, those very bold people in wigs, wrote the history that benefited them. Consider the strange fashion for Cabbage Patch postcards of that era, seemingly a joke, babies found in cabbage patches. But why were there thousands of these postcards? Why did they depict fields strewn with infants being harvested like crops? In the symbolism of secret societies, nothing is ever just by chance. Perhaps it's a direct allusion to bioengineering technologies. Cabbage is a metaphor for layered complexity in artificial structure. We see a hint that the population was restored unnaturally. This was Operation Repopulation. This also explains the emergence of a vast number of noble families that appeared out of nowhere. Many surnames were simply invented and distributed to the most loyal individuals from the incubators, who became overseers of the rest of the populace. A new social hierarchy was being created. The old aristocracy, afflicted by mutations and diseases, needed fresh blood and obedient executives. The foundling hospitals became the forge of a new humanity. Obedient, standardized, and rootless. We live in a world built by orphans. Our culture, our traditions, these are recent constructs created to fill the void in the souls of people who were robbed of their true families. Humanity's global amnesia is not an accident. It's the result of a carefully planned special operation. We were made to forget who we are, and a surrogate was slipped to us instead of the truth. But genetic memory is stronger. Sometimes looking at ancient buildings, at these gigantic doors and columns, we feel a strange longing. This is the voice of that true civilization which was destroyed to populate the world with biorobots. Now that you have scattered pieces of the mosaic, the bald elite, buried cities, impossible technologies, and incubator children, it's time to assemble them into a single terrifying picture. Who stood behind the scenes of this grandiose spectacle? Who pulled the strings of the puppets in powdered wigs? The answer lies not in mysticism, but in the cold logic of resource management. We are dealing with a global shift in management paradigm. Those who came to power in the 19th century were not the creators of civilization. They were liquidators. Imagine a corporation that seized the assets of a bankrupt entity. The bankrupt entity in this case was a previous highly advanced civilization destroyed by a cataclysm. New masters, let's call them global predictors, faced a problem: how to manage the remnants of humanity and millions of newly created clones on the ruins of a world whose technologies they themselves didn't fully understand. They needed to simplify reality. They needed to erase the memory that energy was once free and people lived for hundreds of years. It was then that the greatest sabotage in science and history was carried out. Recall how the ether disappeared from Mendeleev's periodic table. This is not just a chemical element, it's a concept of a universal medium that allows energy to be obtained literally from the air. Old cathedrals and star fortresses were not religious and military objects as we understand them, but stations for collecting and generating atmospheric electricity. Domes, spires, metal frameworks, all these were elements of a unified energy grid. After the catastrophe and the seizure of power, this technology was banned. The bald ones cut the wires, they dismantled resonators, removed metal connections where they could, and declared these structures temples for worshiping gods they themselves invented. We were forced into a hydrocarbon economy: coal, oil, gas. Why? Because what needs to be extracted and sold can be controlled. The ether cannot be controlled. It is everywhere. The prohibition of ether is an act of enslaving humanity through a consumption meter. The aristocracy in wigs was merely a layer, overseers who gained the right to live in palaces in exchange for loyalty and silence. Their illnesses and mutations were the price for proximity to the epicenter of events, for contact with artifacts of the past that radiated death. They wore wigs not only to hide deformity, but also as a uniform distinguishing them from the gray mass of bio-robots raised in foundling hospitals. It was a caste system built on lies. They invented the history of ancient Rome and Greece for us, shifted the chronology thousands of years back to break the connection of time. We were told we evolved from apes so we wouldn't realize that in reality we are the degraded descendants of gods, or even worse, the result of genetic engineering on the ruins of titans. We live in a cargo cult. We use buildings whose purpose we don't understand. We admire columns and porticos thinking they are beauty, though they are functional elements of lost physics. We walk on streets under which lie the actual first floors and we think that's how it should be. But the system is failing. The effect of mass hypnosis is weakening. The internet as a new form of collective consciousness has begun to expose these festering wounds. Why does Tartary occupy half the world on 18th century maps, yet there's not a word about it in textbooks? Why did stone processing technologies degrade from perfect polygonal masonry to crooked brick? All artificial history is a screen stretched over a rotten framework. The Great Reset has already happened, and perhaps more than once. We are at the end of another cycle. The epidemic of the hairless, that was a marker of the beginning of a new era, an era of artificial man detached from nature and cosmos. Hair as antenna connecting to the subtle world was removed to turn people into obedient executives, but genetics takes its toll. We are waking up. We are starting to ask questions, and this is the most terrifying for those who hide in the shadows behind historians and politicians. You don't have to take my word for it. Just go out into the streets of your old city. Look at the windows that disappear into the ground. Look at the granite embankments that cannot be carved with a chisel. Look at the portraits of people in wigs with dead eyes and ask yourself, is this truly the world described in textbooks? Or is it a facade behind which lies the truth about the greatest crime against humanity? We are only at the beginning of the journey. The truth is out there, and it is far more fantastic than any